Hello, I'm representing Group 3, and we decided to focus on forced homelessness amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in South Africa. Our group is Rich Darling, Michelle Duck, Landan Odell, and Kristen Suttles. We are using the BBC clip that is labeled Lockdown South Africa's Authorities Demolish Illegal Shacks. But really comes from a compilation of research that is happening throughout South Africa currently, where there are hundreds and thousands of people who are being removed from their quote unquote shacks during the COVID pandemic, which presents a further health risk to their livelihood.
Well, being locked down due to the coronavirus is tough for people all over the world. But for some South Africans, the situation recently became even worse when their homes were demolished by the authorities, who claimed they were built illegally. The BBC visited one community south of Johannesburg to find out what life during lockdown is like when your home and all your belongings are destroyed. Rodri Davis reports.
When I saw them arrive, I was very scared because I didn't understand what's going on.
In the middle of South Africa's strict lockdown, the local government has destroyed people's homes.
It was a lockdown. We are not supposed to go anywhere. They came, destroyed our shacks. As you can see, the empty spaces there. There were shacks there.
According to national government regulations, no one should be evicted at this time. Authorities say the residents had invaded the land illegally.
My name is Namhla Solomon. I'm mother of 4. I'm a student. I'm 29. This is a place where my house was. My shack was in this place and used to live, used to do everything here. But it took 5 minutes to destroy my shack. Now I have nothing. I'm left with nothing. I'm homeless. I cannot do anything now. They took my things. They took my pot. They took my furniture. They took my textbook because now I'm a student. They took my textbook away from me. We are homeless now. We have nothing.
Namhla and her 2 youngest children now live with neighbours. Social distancing is impossible.
So at this minute, we are five of us living in this. 3 adults, 2 children. It's very painful because now there's no privacy. So we are forced to collect that with the 2 water and wash our hands with it to avoid that corona. It's not possible for the corona to go away, the germs and everything. That water is very dirty. I want my stuff back. I want my freedom back because it was my house, that shack. It meant nothing to them, but to me it meant too many things. It was my world.
The community planned to challenge the evictions in court. Rodri Davis, BBC News.
And so as we can see, she is very distraught, and there's an emotional component there. And there is certainly a phenomenon that is going on that is associated with her home being destroyed. And it's noted that being locked down is tough for people all over the world, but for some South Africans, the situation recently became even worse when their homes were demolished by the authorities, who claim they were built illegally. And we'll go into more information on that as well. We are using a phenomenological approach to this research. And in this research study, we are going to, as future IPers, attempt to understand and describe the essence of the lived and the shared experiences of the participants in South Africa. And we're going to be going about that through in-depth interviews to determine how we will respond as a consultation team to address the problem. It should be noted that we took some liberties here in how we will respond to address the problem. But first, some background on the phenomenological approach. According to Cresswell and Poth, and phenomenon is an 8-step approach, and we first have to decide, is this appropriate for a phenomenological approach? And in this case, it is. We are focusing on the essence of the experience or the phenomenon that is occurring, and we are then identifying that phenomenological intrigue and describing it. And so in this case, we are focusing on the intrigue of what they are experiencing as homeless people who are being moved away because of government regulations. We are going to discuss and describe the broad philosophical assumptions found in phenomenologically. We will go through and collect data through interviews, horizontalization and clusters of meanings for themes. We will be finding themes once our interviews are completed. We are going to develop descriptions and focus again on that essence of the lived experiences. The composite description, where we will be making our ideas more concrete and specific, and then finally writing about the experience. The philosophical assumptions here, we are returning to traditional philosophical tasks. And so before philosophy was even linked to the idea of science, its links were found in Greek philosophy, who were in the search of wisdom. And so the philosophical presuppositions, suspending judgments on what is real until they can be founded on more certainty. Intentionality and consciousness. We are focusing on the conscious idea of the subjects and the participants that are occurring here. And the subject-objective dichotomy refusal, wherein the reality of the object is individualized as it is perceived within the experience of the individual. And so we will be paying close attention to the idea of, again, the essence of the experience. There are several philosophical assumptions in phenomenology, all of which have something in common. They appear based on the lived experiences, viewing the experiences and conscious experiences, and developing descriptions for the essence of the experiences. And it's important to note, first of all, for our research, that there are 3 kinds of homelessness, according to Moyo et al. The first is at most risk in health exposure, and this is the detached homelessness, or people who live unsheltered in a long-term manner. Then you have temporary overnight sleepers who are temporarily unsheltered for a night or for a few nights. People who are temporarily overnight sleepers will be more willing to accept the most unsafe living conditions, that it can include violence, abuse, and bribery in the home of a long-term safety. People in this category are often fleeing other kinds of violence or abuse and are more likely to be children or young adults. And finally, informal settlement dwellers, people who are living in shacks or other temporary shelters. People like this are more likely to consider themselves part of a community, to express feelings of safety and stability, but they still face many health and safety concerns of the unsheltered. And so in our study in South Africa, we are mostly dealing with the last, the informal settlement dwellers. And it is important to note, however, that as soon as the government swept in and destroyed their quote unquote shacks or their homes, they became temporary overnight sleepers. And that can put them, as this research shows, into a risky area, not only for COVID exposure, but also for other traumas to occur, and could be psychologically detrimental to their future. There are about 200,000 people who are homeless in South Africa. This includes informal settlement dwellers, and they are severely undercounted, though, because it is difficult to track, and the stigma of being an informal settlement dweller or someone who lives in a shack. There are many causes. The causes range from housing deficits to poverty to colonial issues, which South Africa has had for the past decades, and unemployment or just slums of rapid development that had occurred because of areas of city that have grown exponentially. Results of this are physical and mental health issues, substance abuse, malnourishment, violence, other higher mortality rates, and again, a higher risk of exposure in the COVID epidemic. Other factors, low income, excessively limited access to healthcare in a country where only 17% of the population has access to healthcare, stigma and discrimination against the homelessness results in delays in accessing care to healthcare, to a general health visit, and even to psychological care. So we are focusing again on the homeless people who became homeless overnight because of government intervention. And primarily, most of these people are men in their teens and early 20s. Most people who are homeless in South Africa were forced out of their homes due to violence or abuse or poverty or real or perceived exposure to AIDS or the death of a parent or a caregiver. Women and children also who become temporary overnight dwellers or detached homeless persons are at great risk of violence and illness and premature mortality. There are a few organizations that do help. Non-government organizations and faith-based organizations are there to help. NGOs are unfortunately underfunded and have trouble accessing the homeless. And faith-based organizations often deal with symptoms of homelessness rather than the causes, which can ultimately keep the homeless people reliant upon the goodwill of the faith-based organization. So when we address the problem after we do some research, we see that there are student-run clinics and that there are housing initiatives. And these could both be helpful. Student-run clinics could be helpful because the students could provide the medical and mental health and case management services in a clinic setting. And that could ultimately help the students gain experience, but also care for the homeless. There was a trial clinic that had high utilization rate, which said that it could be more tolerable to the homeless community than fee-based clinics. And that could be a good thing. Unfortunately, we don't know how much it would save the South African government, and it would be probably expensive. With limited or no studies confirming the clinic could be socially acceptable and able to maintain high utilization, difficulty finding students and volunteers to work with high discrimination population, and a necessity of linking clinics to the referral system. The housing initiatives would provide wraparound services to people who could accept that. The pros: people are immediately housed, socialization and community factors, and this could reduce financial burden on the country. The cons: getting people to accept placement in a housing initiative, because of the stigma and rejection from the surrounding neighborhoods, or difficulty funding and difficulty getting workers to provide these services. We also have to respond to the emotional confrontations that are occurring in this situation. And there was some study on diplomacy, and in this we are fighting over land, or a division of resources. And because of that, we need to seek diplomacy. Recommendations for then diplomatic negotiations to occur. And we recognize this in this case, where the resources are the land and the ownership, and there are emotional connections on both sides. The group who has their homes taken down now have a reason to also distrust the government or the landowners, and the government and the landowners now distrust the persons who have built and lived in the shacks, quote unquote, to stay off their land. This can become an us versus them mentality, which can become dangerous and lead to a case of violence that may occur. So we would like to start a dialogue between the three groups, and we think that's of the utmost importance in order for us to see a diplomatic end to the situation. This could help reduce any violent occurrences that may happen in response to each party's actions. And again, the three groups we're talking about are the government, the landowners, and the informal settlement dwellers who are now kicked out of their homes. The victim in this case is both the landowners, whose land was crossed, but as well as the people who lived in the metal houses or the quote unquote shacks. The perpetrator in this case is the government, as you saw in the video. There should be a negotiation or conflict resolution with trust building reconciliation occurring. We must also be considerate of the past racial discrimination that has been rampant in South Africa and the emotions that are resultant of that. There could be a lack of willingness to want to work with the other party, and we have to address that. We have to also understand that this has happened to hundreds of people across South Africa during the COVID-19 epidemic. And while laws prevent quote unquote squatters from being removed without a court order, but do not prevent squatters from being on land and creating that living environment. And so the quote unquote squatters cannot be removed without the court order. Unfortunately, in this case, the proper licenses were received to remove the dwellers. But does that make it ethical in this time of a health crisis? When investigating this phenomenon, we must consider the privacy and protection of those who are living on a land they do not lawfully own. And again, you could see the emotional connection that Namala had to her house. And to them, she even said, it meant nothing, but to me, it was my home. So we want to encourage a diplomatic discourse between the three parties again. We also want to bring awareness campaigns in the UN concerning human rights violations. There are limitations and challenges to this study, as there are to any. During the current coronavirus pandemic, travel to South Africa is restricted and likely not possible for international psychologists living in other countries to do the study in person. That would prevent us from going in and interviewing with the hundreds of people who were relocated. Locating people in South Africa whose shacks or homes were destroyed and who have experienced this phenomenon could be challenging, again, because of the stigma. The high mortality rate and the stigma of unsheltered homelessness could mean that many potential participants are dead, hospitalized, or unwilling to participate. Getting approval through South Africa's government to do the study could be challenging. South Africa's government is doing what they're doing lawfully and would maybe not like our input in this situation. As well, funding. We have to think about funding and how we are going to get there. But then we also have to think about the ethical concerns of offering incentives for participations to groups of persons who are homeless or without income. And we also have to consider the privacy and the rights of the individuals in this case. They could be against quote unquote squatting or building their shacks again, and we want to protect their location and their names. And we have to think about that during our writing. So in our conclusion, our goals for this phenomenological research are to understand how the phenomena of forced homelessness during the COVID-19 pandemic is understood by the participants in South Africa, the participants, each of the parties, to determine the most productive response to the issue and to offer our services as international psychologists in whatever manner possible. There must be research and action in place. Possible options for action could be the groups to support the dwellers, the student groups and housing projects, groups to help the dwellers out of homelessness, proctoring for a diplomatic solution between the three parties, but again, all with the consideration for the ethical, lawful, and moral implications that are of this study. Here are our references. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this very important problem that we are facing as a world right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, but particularly with great care and astute eyes on South Africans who are facing nights of homelessness. We want to, again, study and and understand the essence of the experience of having a home, losing the home, being relocated forcibly. And then we want to go through and proctor a diplomatic solution. Thank you.